Please listen carefully.
Hello and welcome to GasGasGas, your one-stop podcast for the FRCA Primary Exam. This podcast will fill your brain with information. Listen to it, think about it, and check out the show notes on the website. There you will find the core diagrams you need to be able to draw and describe for the exam. This podcast can squeeze into your day. Listen while you're driving to work, cooking dinner, maybe when you're on call, or in the gym. Eventually the revision is going to end. But for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Remember to rate and follow the show to hear much more. Hello everybody and welcome to GasGasGas. I'm hoping that this is either the final or penultimate jaunt in the Poly-Compart-Mental madness series that we've been experiencing. This is the culmination of a multitude of podcasts prior discussing half-lives, time constants, natural logs, but also hepatic clearance, volumes of distribution, in order to try and get ourselves to a point where we can really appreciate using the tools and pharmacological knowledge at our fingertips to understand how a drug shifts through a human being. This episode has been in draft since before Christmas, as I've tried to determine the best way to tell you all about these crazy things. You'll have to tell me what you think and whether or not I need to wind my anecdotal analogies in a bit. James@gasgasgas.uk is the email address, because I totally appreciate that the next 20 to 25 minutes of your life are going to be a wild ride, but hopefully at the end of it, you'll be like, oh yeah, this lunatic does actually make sense and has brought it back to reality. So we will return to reality by the end of this episode, depending on what you think reality is, everyone. First up, let's just remind ourselves that volume of distribution is fairly reliant on the level of lipid solubility. The quoted volume of distribution for a drug reflects that single compartmental situation, but it's important to think that a volume of distribution also ties to a particular compartment, how readily a drug could dissolve into the fat compartment, for example. I'm going to tell you that most multi-compartmental models have a mix of a plasma compartment or a central compartment, a compartment that receives good blood flow, a compartment that receives poor blood flow, the comparisons here being muscle versus fats, and they sometimes have an effect site compartment, which is the area you're aiming to get drug to in order to exert clinical effect. These drugs generally only consider clearance to occur from the plasma compartment, seems very reasonable, and these models have a multitude of constants that reflect the shift of agent between these compartments and the central compartment. It's important to emphasize that single compartment kinetics make the maths easy and convenient, often being described with those simple half-time, volume of distribution, clearance formulas that we've mentioned before. But unfortunately, simple doesn't mean correct, and even complicated doesn't really mean correct either, guys. But we have to start thinking about these things in a less convenient way because the exam would like us to, and we should probably think about it just for our day-to-day practical work. So, first up, if you have a pint of beer, a glass of wine, and a measure of sambuca, you're going to consume these at all different rates. That means the plasma concentrations of these drugs are all going to occur at different rates with different peaks. That means the graphs of these three different agents will look different. Now, if we lay those curves on top of each other, it might start looking a little bit like a graph that reflects the shift of agents through multiple compartments having been introduced to a central compartment. This central compartment is key and is often defined along with the other compartments by the weight, height, age, and gender that you put into these models. Interestingly, this central compartment or plasma compartment is likely to be the most anatomically relatable to a human compared to these other ones, because we can theoretically measure how much plasma someone has, although, again, I don't think anyone would be terribly impressed if you were to do it. In counterpoise to that, the other compartments are quite a little bit more theoretical, and they do not reflect a specific set of tissues. You could seek to develop a model that was anatomically and physiologically more reflective. It would get exponentially more complicated as the interplay between all these compartments went about their business. But also, you can imagine this would be deeply challenging because you might start thinking that different parts of organs receive different amounts of blood flow and therefore would have to be reflected differently. This could go on forever, and ultimately it will fail to be of any clinical use. And that is why we have these moderately fudged compartments that approximately reflect the average volume, blood flow, kinetics of pharmacologically and physiologically relevant bits of a human. I think we'd all be much better off if someone would be so kind as to set up a model where you can program in the bolus you reckon you want to give and over how much time, with an effect site target of your choosing at perhaps 2 minutes or 5 minutes, in order to avoid that kind of slow, dozy, doze off to sleep and prevent you from having to just bolus some propofol and then start your TCI. Which, on paper, means that you don't truly know what your effect site is. You can presume it's probably marginally higher. But then, the important thing is to think about what factors govern the shift of agent between these compartments. Because clearly we have to have an appreciation of that first. When thinking about this interplay, you need to consider the molecular weight of the drug given. Big stuff doesn't get across membranes as much as small stuff. The molecule's solubility, blood flow, the clearance, the protein binding, the receptor affinity in your effect site compartment, and the presence of other agents that might displace the one you're interested in from where you're aiming to go. It's important to have a notion of these, but unless you're going to be the next Schneider, don't worry about it too much. Just appreciate that Fick's law of diffusion plays out here just as much as elsewhere. So, now for the main thrust of it all. Buckle up, locate some coffee, maybe read the show notes first, and my dearest apologies in advance for the unusual journey we're going to take. So we need to think back in our minds and to a previous podcast on fentanyl, because that's the example we're going to use here. And we know that if you infuse plenty of fentanyl over a long, long period of time, you will fill the patient with fentanyl. I'm going to try and convey the size of this lipid compartment we're going to play with to you and say that it is the size of the largest lake in the known world, and that's actually the Caspian Sea. We're going to call it the Caspian adiposity. In this slightly hyperbolic patient situation, we're going to assume that we've trickled fentanyl in for such a long period of time at greater than the rate of clearance that we have filled this Caspian Sea with fentanyl, and that at the concentration we're aiming for in their plasma, if we were to give them any much more, that plasma concentration would start creeping up as we've almost fully filled that plasma compartment at that concentration. May their goblet overflow with fentanyl. So now, if we are thinking about measuring plasma concentration over time, we could think about how this journey to filling them up goes. The crux here is that you would need to infuse fentanyl at a rate faster than the liver and kidneys were eradicating it from the system. Lower than that, you will never fill the patient. Higher than that, you will begin to fill the patient. The other dictator here is, do we want to see a clinical effect, and how quickly do we want to see that clinical effect? If we were seeking to see it promptly, we could either start a fast fixed infusion rate, therefore ensuring that we achieved higher plasma concentrations and subsequently higher concentrations in the brain where we're aiming for, or a bolus and then a slower rate of fixed infusion. And remember, we're trying to fill this patient with fentanyl. If we were to just give that bolus, though, remember, we would hit high concentrations in the central nervous system very quickly, but they would rapidly redistribute and your clinical effect would disperse. For the sake of our hyperbolic Caspian patient, we're going to aim for a fixed rate of infusion that surpasses hepatic clearance and renal clearance, and we're going to allow it to reach a steady state. It doesn't have to be a specific concentration, I quote here. Just imagine I've started an infusion, 4 to 5 half times have occurred, and we're now at a steady state in that plasma. So if we imagine our graph of log concentration on the y-axis and time in linear on the x-axis, we've started our infusion, and we've seen a slow upward incline that has leveled off as a steady state of fentanyl in versus fentanyl out. And when I say out, I mean out of the plasma, not out of the patient entirely, has occurred, and we are cruising at a steady state. And the patient might be experiencing some pain relief and being quite happy about this at this point in time. And now we're going to watch, and we're going to watch and watch and watch some more as this seemingly steady state continues until it begins to climb. What has happened here is you've likely achieved saturation of one of your compartments, the more readily perfused compartment. At that point, we'd have to turn our fixed rate of infusion down, try and figure out exactly where we want to be to return to our steady state. We're now achieving the same concentration and subsequent effect in the patient, but we're giving a lower rate of infusion. More time, might go drink a cup of tea, go have some fish and chips, and then we notice our plasma concentration begins to climb again. We've now saturated the less readily perfused compartment, the Caspian adiposity. We have to titrate our fentanyl rate down even further at this point to achieve a return to that steady state. At this point in time, your infusion rate is actually going to reflect the hepatic and renal clearance rate in this system. This is truly where you might find your patient in a steady state for an exceedingly long period of time, unless something were to physiologically change with your patient. You improved their clearance, you impaired their clearance. And here we are at an interesting place, whereby the concentration of fentanyl in this human is fairly homogeneous across their plasma, their central nervous system, their muscles, their organs, their fats, all more or less the same, or frankly exactly the same concentration in these separate compartments. Now it's important to think about the fact that these separate compartments have differing volumes of distribution. So if you've got a very capacious compartment like the Caspian Sea, you can fit loads of fentanyl in there before you'll start to meet the concentration at which the rate of fentanyl going into the compartment matches the rate of fentanyl going out of the compartment as you've achieved that dynamic equilibrium. The difference here between a multi-compartmental human and a single compartmental human is that we might get tempted to think that the patient has a very high concentration gradient of agents not in the plasma versus in the plasma. But we must take into account the fact that it is in a theoretical space dictated by the lipid solubility and volume of distribution of that compartment. And at that equilibrium point, there won't be a difference in concentration between these two compartments. Until, that is, we stop infusing the patient with fentanyl. At that point, plasma concentration goes down and a gradient forms, although it's not a gradient of amount of fentanyl in human versus amount of fentanyl in plasma, because it's governed by the rates of clearance that we'll go over in a minute. But first, a few hypothetical patients to really illustrate this situation. If, at this point in time where we stopped our cessation of fentanyl, we also had a patient who suddenly had no liver or kidneys, then that amount of fentanyl is just going to stay in them. There's no way for it to get out. And they would just get stuck at that steady state, probably feeling quite relaxed, I imagine, sans their kidneys and liver, which I'm sure they'd be moderately concerned about. If we were to take this to the opposing extreme of a patient whose metabolic fentanyl moppery skills are so excellent that it can clear fentanyl like, I don't know, Usain Bolt can run the 100-meter sprint, mightn't we find ourselves in a situation where the clearance from the plasma is so efficient that we suck fentanyl from our effect site and other compartments so quickly that the effects of the fentanyl are immediately curtailed because no further agent can possibly get into the central nervous system. Now, for fentanyl, this situation couldn't really occur because even if the liver and kidneys were so remarkably effective, they do not receive the entire cardiac output. So some agent circulating in the plasma will dodge clearance and recirculate past the central nervous system. So it won't work for us in this way. But you may get closer to this situation in drugs in which the plasma is getting busy clearing the agent. And the two that spring to my mind here are suxamethonium and remifentanil. Suxamethonium is cleared by plasma pseudocholine esterase, and remifentanil by non-specific plasma esterases. But we have to think reality is nowhere near as exciting as this hypothetical delight of something that can be eradicated in an instant. But Remi gets somewhat close with its 9 to 11 minute half-time and its relatively unsaturatable enzyme system. Read Michaelis-Menten. Show notes, listen to Michaelis-Menten podcast. So, returning to our polycompartmentalized, fentanyl-riddled human, we know that in this situation, the shift into the plasma from the exceedingly vast Caspian adiposity, lipid store, maintains a reasonable fentanyl concentration in our human model. We know that the clearance is such that the patient will allow this fentanyl to slosh around in the plasma, looking for its next home. and we know that some of it will be mopped up by the kidneys, whilst some of it is tottering off to other places to reside. So here we go, back to our graph of log concentration on the y, time linear on the x, and we've turned off that fixed rate infusion, and our graph has started to tip down very slowly back towards 0. Check out the show notes for these graphs, by the way, guys. But now we've got to think about how these drugs are shifting through this human to get out, and what their behaviour might look like. And for that, I'm going to introduce some anecdote that we're then going to tie back to compartments. Well, I want you to imagine a bathtub, and this bathtub is the plasma. And in that plasma, as you well know, there's some fentanyl floating around. But now we're going to introduce holes to this bathtub, going down the sides, many holes at the top, dropping off to fewer holes at the bottom. Only fentanyl can get out of these holes, and you can imagine that when there are many holes, quite a bit of fentanyl is cleared, but as you creep down that bathtub, less and less fentanyl can escape as the fentanyl empties out of the human. This is a way to reflect half-life. You've got to imagine a big bathtub, because now we're going to put a bin bag, trash bag, garbage bag, depending on your terminology. It's obviously closed at the top. It's a bit flabby, almost a bit fatty looking, and this is full of quite a large space. It's bigger on the inside than the outside, and it's only got a couple of holes in, and this too is full of fentanyl at the same concentration as our plasma was. We're going to then introduce a bucket. This too is full of the same concentration of fentanyl as the plasma, and this too is inadvertently seemingly larger on the inside than the outside, but not so much as the trash bag, and it has more holes than the bin bag to reflect that it is more readily perfused. Things can move in and out of it more easily. And the pièce de la résistance is a rubber ducky effect site. This is a rubber duck. Other bathtub related toys can be used with a further number of holes in. Remember guys, these holes in these compartments that allow shift of drug between compartments are drug specific, i.e. some drugs move quicker than others, as we well know. If you're struggling to imagine this bathtub, bin bag, bucket, rubber ducky madness, take a look at the crazed diagram on the show notes. If you were to imagine that you turn off the fentanyl fixed rate tap into this bathtub, and we know that there's a fentanyl clearance rate out of the bathtub, there's going to be a bit of turbulence occurring as the presumed rate of influx of fentanyl has stopped. Things need to re-equilibrate. There's a bit less fentanyl in the plasma, so some of the fentanyl from the lipid store, the bin bag, has to ooze out. Some of the fentanyl from the bucket, the well-perfused, muscly store, needs to ooze out. It all has to do a bit of a wibble and a wobble. Imagine that these are waves of equilibration occurring in your bathtub. I'd like to caveat that our rubber ducky effect site is a confused little fellow because his existence, whilst clearly likely to be true, is deeply in question as to how big he is, how many holes the poor fellow has, and therefore, in our system, how buoyant the little rubber ducky fellow may be. And this is because it is not cricket to infuse a drug into a human being for a long period of time and then do a brain biopsy to find out how much drug is actually where you're interested. You could have even radio tagged or some such crazy biochemical things to see how much drug is in there and where it is. All not sport. So we have to rely on our clearly existent but of unknown morphological significance rubber ducky. So imagining this mad model, you can now appreciate that fentanyl is going to want to shift around these multiple compartments using the bathtub as its means of transfer, and that each of these compartments has differing behaviours compared to its friends because of its different rate of perfusion and of what material is being perfused. We know that everything diffuses down concentration gradients, and even if there was other forms of shift, remember we've got facilitated diffusion and active transport, channels, etc. We don't really need to appreciate how the drug shifts, just that it does shift, and that with each change that you deliver to the system, it has to re-equilibrate. So if we were to accidentally exsanguinate a patient, then we must think that we've emptied their plasma compartment. Perioperatively, less of a concern if it's a heavily fat-soluble molecule, and more of a concern if it's a predominantly water-soluble molecule, because naturally, most of that agent is going to be in your bathtub, and only a scant amount in your bin bag, or your bucket, or your rubber duck, and therefore exsanguination is going to play a more pivotal role in the amount of drug in that human being. This is perhaps why it's always a good idea to remember, guys, that if your patient is prolifically bleeding to death, whilst they may not need as much anesthesia from a physiological perspective, don't forget that the amount of antibiotics in them has greatly diminished, and you might think about giving them an extra dose of those prophylactic agents. So, we have our rubber ducky effect site, and our rubber ducky is experiencing a clinical effect that is dictated by the concentration in our rubber ducky effect site. It's important to bear in mind that different concentrations might yield different clinical effects. You might see side effects from a drug, unfortunately, at a lower concentration than the intended benefits of the drug that may require a higher concentration to achieve. Every time you titrate your drug to achieve an intended clinical effect, a new steady state has to bear out within your system. You create waves, remembering that it takes 4 to 5 half times for a new steady state to form. But to make your brain hurt, there's a multitude of different half times bearing out in this system when you make a change, because the rate of shift from plasma to bin bag is governed by its own constants, a constant for in and a constant for out. Therefore, this re-equilibration is occurring across 4 to 5 steady states across a number of different half times that are bearing out when you make that change. So if we go back to our patient model, our slightly hyperbolic Caspian Sea, and we've turned off our fixed rate infusion, we are going to see descent of our curve. The descent of this curve is dictated by the clearance rate, but also the shift of agent back into a central compartment from these external compartments. If clearance was sufficiently high and rate of shift was sufficiently low, you might find yourself in a convenient place of being subclinical in your effect. Our patient stops feeling very relaxed, and their pain comes back. They're still full of oodles of fentanyl, but it can't exert its effect because its rate of shift is just too slow. That would be convenient. However, it doesn't terribly bear out like that, and the effects of fentanyl linger for quite some time at the cessation of our very prolonged infusion. This is what bears out when you're thinking about comparing the context-sensitive half-times of different drugs. Those with a high volume of distribution on paper and those with a prolonged half-time will subsequently have an exceedingly long context-sensitive half-time, a double whammy of bother when you're trying to get your patient awake, breathing and extubated on intensive care. And that's why in the UK you won't see a fentanyl infusion on ITU, really ever. There are better options out there. So you've imagined this bathtub of steady state achieving ripples of equilibration every time you turn your infusion up or your infusion down. But we need to come back to reality, because we can't just think about bathtubs and rubber ducks in the exam, because we would thoroughly embarrass ourselves. So to tie it all together, remember that our bathtub is in fact our plasma compartment. When you're looking at these models in schematic form on paper, in Peck and Hill for example, the central compartment is called C1 or V1. Our fairly well perfused bucket is the vessel-rich compartment, or sometimes it's called the vessel-rich group. This is C2 or V2. Our barely perfused bin bag is the vessel-poor store, vessel-poor group, C3 or V3. And our rubber ducky effect site is generally denoted by a big C little e or a big phi V little e. In amongst all these compartments in this schematic form are the interchange coefficients. These are denoted by a K for constant, and then two numbers afterwards that reflect the shift from where to where. So from plasma to vessel-rich compartment, or from bathtub to bucket, would be K12 or K bathtub bucket. K10 reflects the clearance from the central compartment, the rate of clearance. That's because 0, or compartment 0, is considered the outdoors, the non-effective, the in-your-urine compartment. So I do terribly apologise for the analogy. I hope it makes some sense, because it's really important to bear in mind that re-equilibration occurs and steady state has to resume before you can really know how much of a clinical effect you're truly achieving with your drug. If you look at your propofol TCI model, as you dial up the effect site concentration, it will actually overpressure the effect site by delivering a higher plasma concentration to try and get the concentration in the effect site you desire sooner. It doesn't want to overshoot though in this point, and it knows approximately what it thinks is the right amount to give. Anyway, to summarise this journey through polycompartmental madness, it's important to understand the shifts between these compartments is something that you already think about when you're doing a volatile anaesthetic. So don't be terrified of TIVA, just have a good read, do it with supervision, and accept that it seems really complicated, but in reality you're using a machine that just infuses propofol for you, giving you a hand. Remember that between these compartments, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a reason why computers are doing it for us, so don't be terribly terrified by the formulas that you have to learn for the exam. The podcast before that provides an idiot's guide structure to barfing up that formula that you can almost write on the fly, depending on how many compartments they want you to talk about, because it's just the same thing repeated over and over, and you add them together to reflect each compartment. There's a link in the show notes to 2 applications, one a TIVA simulator that's in a web browser, and then pointing you in the direction of a TIVA simulator on the App Store, both quite fun things to play with to get an idea of what's really occurring. And I want to close out with, you could choose to use TIVA or the target controlled infusion pharmacokinetic software within a syringe driver as a black box, and actually your clinical endpoint isn't a number on that black box, but it is if the patient is asleep or not, because that's what we're really after. BIS, processed EEG, or the density spectral array that you get with that is very helpful. But one thing is to note, in that national audit project, can't remember which one, looking at awareness, patients who are paralysed and TIVA'd were an order of magnitude more likely to have awareness than those who were not paralysed and being TIVA'd. So only paralyse them if you have to, use short-acting paralysing agents, and make sure that that cannula site is okay. If it seems like you're using an incredibly large amount of propofol to keep someone who really doesn't need it asleep, then they're not getting all the drug you're giving them. Figure out why. That was a lot of talking, guys. Thank you very much for listening. I'd actually like to say welcome to all the new listeners that are listening in over the last few episodes, especially you guys in India and Turkey and Sweden. I didn't think people would be listening from there. That's cool. If you like it, tell your mates. And you guys in India, I've made sure to put the podcast on the Ghana platform. That should be live in a couple of days once they accept the RSS feed, just to make your lives a bit easier. Anyway, my name's James. You've been listening to Gas Gas Gas, and I promise the next episode is not going to be quite so crazy. If you found it useful or awful, please like and subscribe and rate the show. Definitely check out the show notes for those diagrams and the detail of this content. It is a bucket of content to get to grips with. Keep working at it, and you will get better, faster, and stronger. It is vital to keep your interest live for the science that we're covering and not overcook yourself. You will be amazed by what you know come exam day. Don't freak out. Keep studying.